Chapter 4 What Lies in Shadows PV-01 Administrative Quarter Planetary Archives Twilight wasn't moving. Time had slowed to a crawl. Seconds stretched to minutes, hours, days even, but her brain was racing. Information piled in her mind and was just as quickly filtered depending on its usefulness. Scents, sounds, colors, shapes. Each one of her senses unraveled the scene to its bare components. She could almost feel the grenade rolling slowly toward her. She sensed Spike turning toward her. She could almost taste his concern before it even started warming its way on his face. The unicorn didn't move as the grenade hit her armored hoof, but shock had no hold on her. Her training had already kicked in. Her brain was racing. Everything disappeared from Twilight's consciousness. Everything but the grenade at her hooves. The device was custom-made, but clearly based on regular Imperial anti-vehicle crack grenade models. Impractical. Enough to hurt her. It hadn't exploded yet, so the fuse was still on. She had 10 seconds, likely less. She had to get rid of it. Her focus shifted. She looked around. Herds of ponies were coming from a distance. Not the streets. No way around. She looked up. The sky was clear. There was a way out. Time resumed, and Twilight moved at last. The war mare gripped the grenade in her ceramic-clad hoof and teleported. Twilight ascended, not high enough. Roofs flashed before her eyes as she went. Higher. She teleported. Once more, until she reached her goal, a small opening in the confining of buildings. Here. Gathering as much strength as she could on such a short notice, Twilight threw the device. It exploded as soon as it left her hooves, but the Equestode was already gone. Lavender lights flashed once again in the darkening sky like the first thunderbolts of an incoming tempest. There was a heavy shock when the massive unicorn in armor fell on the ground, right at her starting point. Less than 10 seconds had passed, but Twilight came back to a very different scene than the one she had left. Fresh blood flowed lazily around her golden horseshoe, and Lou in place of her serf was a corpse of Pegasus. Blood poured irregularly through his sliced throat. A simple look was enough to understand that the pony was already beyond salvation, save maybe for the work of a skilled medicae. Twilight, however, didn't care for their fate. She had more important problems right now. Spike was missing. Spike? For the second time in a very frustrating day, her servitor didn't answer, but this time none of the possibilities were reassuring. She checked her surroundings, her retinal display scanning the room in detail, her other senses instantly looking for any trace of the dragon. She didn't locate him, but she found something else. Hooves clapping on the ground, going away from her. She instantly turned toward the source, and an exasperated groan left her muzzle as she found herself facing the archives. What had been a haven less than 10 minutes ago was now a potential battlefield. Why am I not surprised? She brooded, her horn glowing as her staff left its maglock to levitate at her side. At this point I should expect chaos cultists in an ambush. Without further ado, Twilight teleported inside the building. The empty entry hallway of the administrative archive was briefly illuminated by a flash of lavender light before returning to its flickering, dark, and by many standards impractical level. Despite the circumstances, Twilight could not help but spare an appreciative glare at the place. While not as big as Canterlot's archives, the archives were still inviting. Years of underponied care had turned the place into a maze of shelves filled with raw data in any form known to ponykind. Any form known and authorized by the Inquisition, anyway. Grouped in the faintest semblance of order. The majority would be useless, but there should be interesting pieces of information lying here and there. Unfortunately, she would have to wait before she could study it further. Twilight went further into the archive, hoping that the running pony had her serf and some answers. Twilight ran like a thunderstorm closing on an unexpected shore, her heavy armored hooves thundering on the stone floor like the fury of some old pagan goddess. She bolted through the walls and flashed through shelves, reclaiming meters after meter on her prey. Twilight ran, and the place shook in fear from her rumbling course. And Twilight ran, her steady heartbeats and the rhythmic laps of fleeing hooves pacing her. A few shelves and turns only prevented her to see her prey and strike, for now. Soon. Twilight ran, getting closer. She could glimpse her mark now. A dark cloak hid most of their features, save for a puffy tail and the locks of a curly mane, and an unconscious dragonling on their back. More magic poured into the staff each passing second. Bolts of energy crackled around it, making the shadows recoil in terror. All she needed now was the right moment, the right opportunity. Soon. Twilight and her prey ran, deep into the archive through the hidden paths and halls, old and forgotten. Separated by only a few meters, Twilight felt the chase nearing its end. The tang of ozone, sweet and chemical stimulants, filled the air around her. It smelled like victory. Now! A golden and lavender thunderbolt flew toward the runaway pony at an astonishing speed. There was no place to hide, there was no time to dodge. She was about to hit. She should have hit, but she didn't. In an instant, as if sensing the incoming attack, the runaway turned. It was nonsensical, almost unnatural movement, but it still happened. The running pony turned, losing none of their speed, right into the wall, getting through it as if it was made of paper. The staff continued its course, pulverizing a shelf and crashing into the wall behind it. Surprise dulled the reaction of the Equesto, making her pass the hole for a few meters before she could react appropriately. It didn't take long, mere seconds, but it was enough. When she finally got through the new passage, her target was gone. Frustration made its way through Twilight's throat, manifesting itself in a low grumble. With a thought, she took back her staff and made it hover at her side while she penetrated the new room with circumspection. As the thrill of the chase was fading, Twilight realized how deep she had gone into the building. Darkness had grown so thick that the faint glow of her staff was barely enough for even Twilight's senses to correctly assess the room. Wary of ambushes, Twilight increased the intensity of the light surrounding her horn and staff. The shadows fled, hiding between the shelves and various rubbles and irregularities on the ground, revealing a room which made the entrance look organized. It was vast, though it was hard to have a precise idea in that obscurity, and was as much filled with knowledge as it was made of it. There were scrolls and books made of paper, vellum, and papyrus, and every support where a pony could put ink on. There were data slates, holo projectors, coggators, and even deactivated servitors whose sole function seemed to be to recite the information they had been filled with, and this was only half of what Twilight could see. All around her, knowledge in all its variety of physical forms, escaping the restraining confines of the shelves, joined the walls, floor, and even ceiling in some parts. Decades, centuries, millennia worth of data, reports and story gathered in one place. Yet Twilight ignored it. The only thing she could see was the way too numerous hiding places it provided. She went on, cautiously now, all her senses in alert, wary of an ambush. She had let things get out of control, a luxury she could not afford. It was becoming quite the bad habit. Maybe she had neglected her training more than she cared to admit. However, now she was focused. Her mind was clear. She could think and analyze her situation, making some details she had overlooked blatantly obvious. It boiled down to one thing. Her prey had successfully escaped the wrath of an equestrian by her, with the dragon on their back, without getting lost or getting into an impasse. This showed incredible strength, willpower, endurance, training, and an extensive knowledge of the building. This was not a feat within every pony's reach. Whoever this was, they were no ordinary pony. Twilight was still formulating hypotheses when something caught her attention. At first it was nothing more than a distant whisper, but the more she focused on it, the wronger it felt. It took her a few moments to identify the sound and a few more to get its provenance. In the depths of the archives, ponies were chanting. Twilight dimmed the light of her staff and went deeper into the archive. Soon. Spike shifted in and out of consciousness. Senseless dreams plagued his fevered mind. Sometimes he could grasp something out of his vision, or maybe his visions were influenced by what was happening around him. He was fleeing something, or something was running away from him. Sometimes, when reality drew closer, he could feel the steady pace of a pony running under him. Not a mere pony, a war mare. Twilight? He knew the difference. Something inside him woke at the thought of Twilight fleeing. A spark in the midst of the fog that now inhabited his brain. Thoughts started to gather around it, creating a semblance of coherence. Consciousness was winning its battle for dominance. The fog was starting to retreat, leaving him confused but aware. The first thing he realized was that he wasn't running anymore. He was sitting, and nothing moved, not even his own body. A static panic took him as he felt his body struggle to obey its command. It was numb and heavy. Opening his eyes asked more effort than he could gather. Even his senses were dulled to the point he barely felt the books uncomfortably pressed against his back scales. A painful groan formed and stayed in his throat, turning into a barely audible gurgle. Next to him, some pony, moved and got closer. The sound of hooves softly clapping on the floor reverberated strangely in his fins.
Are you awake?
Said a distorted voice. The feeling of a hoof pressed on his scale made him flinch, the pathetic equivalent that his body now permitted. That was enough for the pony, however.
Good.
Spike tried to move, to force his muscles to obey. A shiver went through his muscles as a result.
Don't worry, it'll pass. You've been a teensy-weensy bit drugged, you see. Should be gone in a jiffy, maybe two.
Another failed groan passed through the dragon's lips.
Shush, silly. You're gonna swallow your tongue, and we don't want that now, do we? Now stay here and don't make a noise. Your mistress is coming, and I don't want to miss the fun. Just relax and enjoy the soothing sound of gunshots.
The click of a rifle being loaded punctuated her sentence and sent a chill down Spike's spine. Inside the confines of his fogged mind and drugged body, all the dragon could do was curse his weakness. As she drew closer to the chantings, Twilight started to grasp more of the words, and she wished she hadn't. She wasn't sure what made her skin crawl, the words spoken or the heresy contained within them. Probably both. It didn't matter either way. The empty hallways were dimly lit by archaic torches probably made with the materials on Hoof. The thought was cringeworthy, but the mere presence of a heretic in her living quarters left her with little to no room in her mind for more dissatisfaction. There were several dozens of ponies, all gathered in a relatively small room, or whatever the space delimited by books and furniture could be called. As far as Twilight could see from her position, there was only one entrance and thus only one exit, which made her task way easier. For the Empress, she whispered. Twilight entered the room. The first cultist didn't even realize his death. He simply wondered why his voice wouldn't come out anymore. Blood loss quickly got the better of his thinking ability as the staff that had perforated his throat left the wound. Two more followed as the golden blade sliced through their neck and temple. The decapitated pony marveled at the rising floor before everything went dark. The sound gurgled as her jaw enjoyed the sudden freedom that a brain removal would grant. At this point, some cultists realized something was wrong, namely a demigoddess clad in gold slaughtering them. Three more ponies died before any alarm was raised. By the time the cultist defenses started to organize, Twilight's victim count was in the double digits. There was a pause as the Equestode stood before the exit. The heretics watched her in awe, unsure of how to interpret the presence of one of the Empress's daughter in their midst. The staff lazily flew at the left side of the war mare, the blade facing the assembly as if passing in silent judgment on the crowd. Then its dance started anew, and more heretics died. Somewhere in the archive, through a sniper lens, some pony watched the fight with great interest. The spectacle was like nothing she'd ever seen. It was not a destruction of the enemy, it was something else, something more. The cloaked pony watched in amazement as the lone unicorn moved with deadly efficiency, each motion resulting in the disarming, impairment, or death of a cultist. It was beautiful in its own way. It was a dance of death, and the cultists were trying and failing to follow the pace imposed by the war mare. It was truly beautiful. Too bad she had to cut it short. Many more heretics lay on the ground before any worthwhile resistance manifested itself. At first they had tried to fight or flee, but miserably failed at both. Without the proper equipment, they could barely make a dent on Twilight's armor, let alone hurt her. Now they merely tried to defend their life, with very similar results. For a moment the unicorn wondered if they would keep getting in line to be slaughtered, but she suspected she wouldn't be so lucky, and for once, unfortunately, reality met her expectations. As one, the ponies started moving. At first glance it looked like they were fleeing again, trying to get as much space as possible between them and the Equesto. Twilight knew better. This was not the panic attitude of a herd of ponies fleeing. This was something else, something she had already seen countless times in the barracks. Ponies getting far enough not to get drawn into something bigger than them, but not too far so they could see as much as possible of what was to come. It was the organized yet unconscious moves of a crowd about to assist the duel. They were making a ring for her and whatever stood as their champion. Pondering her options, Twilight decided to wait for her foe to come out. Whispers and hushed praises rose from the crowd as the pony fended it. Said champion was a unicorn. They were young. If their look was anything to go by, they were probably fresh into adulthood. They wore heresy as a robe, both literally and figuratively. It was almost stereotypical. If their unholy word-ridden piece of clothes wasn't enough to identify their allegiance, they had elected to paint the characteristic eight-branched star on their unmaned head, centered on their horn, and did the same on their tailless flank. But Twilight need not those to mark them. The influence of the warp was so thick around the yellow unicorn, enough to make the Equesto's skin crawl. If she could, she'd have sentenced them to death twice or more. Twilight didn't lose time. As soon as her prey was in sight, she attacked. She threw her staff with all her strength, making it spin so fast it looked like a disc. The golden chakram-like projectile hit the position, crashed into the crowd of bowing cultists, leaving a pile of broken bodies in its wake. Twilight dared a victorious smile. It quickly faded, and instead a frustrating groan almost managed to escape her muzzle. The Psycho was still there, standing a few meters away from their initial position, a satisfied smile on their face. They were waiting, waiting for Twilight to make the first move. Again. The war mare was happy to oblige. She sent her staff again, faster. More ponies died, but their leaders survived, untouched. This was no illusion. They were as real as she was. She had no doubt about it. Somehow, they used their vile sorcery to nullify her blows. She sent the staff a third time, trying a flurry of attacks instead of a powerful one, stabbing at the Psycho's position again and again. This attempt yielded no results. Twilight's dissatisfaction was reaching its peak. Instead of a fight, she was caught in another pointless chase. The Psycho seemed to have no intention to actually confront their foe. They annoyingly shifted in and out of reality, escaping her attacks. Even more infuriating was the feeling, more of an educated deduction, that something was afoot. It was obvious the Psycho was waiting for something. They were stalling and she knew it. It was pretty obvious. They could barely keep up with this. Their breath was getting short and shallow. Their coat was drenched in sweat. At times, they almost struggled to stand up. Meanwhile, the Equestode was barely phased. Yet they kept going. Soon they would slip up and get caught by the staff or claimed by one of the very forces they used to cheat death. Yet they kept going. There was barely anything the Lavender Unicorn could do about it. Yet. But it didn't make things any less unsatisfactory. Every attack avoided by the Psycho, every fanatical smile on the faces of the heretics as they died, taking blows intended for their leader, every second she was forced to stay here instead of looking for Spike just added to an already overfilled pool of frustration. The staff struck again, killing two more cultists. The Psycho re-emerged, a mere meter away, a mocking smirk on their face. Twilight Sparkle was no longer merely dissatisfied. Despite their efforts and exhaustion, Lasting Chains could not contain the victorious smile on their face. True, the false Emperor's horse had taken them by surprise and killed many of them, but she was alone and they had something in store for the scenario. Psycho just had to stall there for long enough for the rest of the cultures to prepare the counterattack. Another blow was struck at them, and Lasting Chains let the grip of the warp claim them again. The material world faded to be replaced with the taunting faces of demons. They were gathering around the Psyker, testing their defenses, haunting them, waiting for the small slip, the small lapse in their concentration that would expose the tasty-looking soul of the unicorn. It was getting harder to ignore the inhuman faces shouting, pleading, shushing, promising, whispering, crying, laughing, or not limited to any combination of the former. But victory was at hoof. Lasting Chains knew better than to blow it up at the last minute. Drawing in their soon-to-be failing strengths, they emerged of the warp, ready to taunt the Imperial foe once again. Lasting Chains just had time to see the face of a purple demigoddess contorted with anger before the world collapsed. Something thumped them. No, it felt more like they had been sent at an incredible speed on a plasteel wall. The whole skeleton quaked at the impact. The body went limp like a broken toy. Reality lost its substance. There was only darkness. Lasting Chains felt like they were flying. Maybe they were. They couldn't feel the ground anymore. Maybe sleeping would make things make sense again? A shock, softer than the previous one, woke them up. Last time, is my itter, came a voice from outside the darkness. It took an undetermined amount of time for the psyker to understand. It was as dreadful as staggering. They were screamed at so loudly it hurt like a kick in the face. For the first time since the beginning of the fight, they foolishly got to. Lasting Chains realized just how dangerous this war mare was. Must stop her. A thought emerged at the surface of her consciousness. They cast a spell using whatever life force remained in their broken body, a spell that had got them their name. Lasting Chains died, with the small comfort that the demons ripping their soul to shreds was slightly less frightening after having faced the wrath of an Equestode. The Psyker hung limply at the end of the leg of the ticked-off Equestode, broken and barely conscious from a kick delivered to their face. Twilight groaned in frustration as she realized they were too far gone to answer her questions. She was about to direct her anger toward the crowd watching the spectacle when she realized the trap she had fallen into. They had managed to catch her attention long enough. She had not noticed the cannon pointed at her. It had taken her less than a day to show negligence again. Unacceptable, she thought laconically. Cloaked Mare grinned as her prey was, at last, in position. There was a light click as she lightly pressed the trigger.
Let's end this party with a bang.
Twilight tried to move, but she found herself unable to do so as chains of power were starting to cover her body. It wouldn't hinder her long, a handful of seconds, but she didn't really have that. Truly unacceptable. The detonation filled the room. Bullet shell rolled toward Spike with a maddening slowness, making a shrill sound while doing so. Anger and shame rose inside him, cutting through the fog that invaded his thoughts, as they rallied behind one very simple idea, getting up and bringing pain to those who'd hurt his lady. His body struggled against the chemicals in his muscles, making him shake violently and erratically at the effort. The feeling of helplessness was nauseating, the pain even worse, but the dragon refused to let go. So he thought. The noise of a sniper rifle reloading had a bone-chilling effect Spike was still unfamiliar with. A dissonant thought started to hijack his efforts. I'm going to die. Hungry for the territory it had lost, the fog came back, to be brutally thrown out. There is no way I'm going without a fight. Spike's efforts redoubled and the fog definitively leapt as the anger rose inside him. I am the monitor of Equesto, the Twilight Sparkle, defender of the throne, and I will live and I will die like it. The poison in his muscles started to recede. Still shaking, Spike slowly rose to his feet.